Computer, yes. Okay. Today we are going to continue to our talk about the difference between the oikos and the chromatistics market exchange. This distinction is important from a historical point of view, of course, and history of economics we are talking about, right? Basically, but when it comes to talk about history, the natural question is that what is the correct or proper methodology to approach history? There are different positions about that. There are different accounts developed by different writers. One, arguably most famous account about history is Karl Marx's historical materialism, or the materialist conception of history. It's very simple. We are going to talk about it also. It basically argues that if you want to understand a specific society, you should look at the productive apparatus in general, and what he calls relations of production and the forces of production. Forces of production include technology and resources, as we call them in economics, right? And relations of production refers to the social organization of production process in general. And Marx argues that these two levels form the economic base of the society, or what he calls mode of production. And upon this economic base is this superstructure, what Marx calls superstructure, which includes the state political apparatus, even science and art, and even other non-economic institutions or relations. So he argues that the causality runs from the base to the superstructure. So if you want to understand any society, first thing you should do is to look at the economic base, and therefore the relations of production and the relationship between these relations of production and the forces of production, because social change is to be explained by a conflict between the relations of production and the forces of production. It's something like this. But before discussing this account of historical materialism, we may go back to what we have been talking about, the famous oikos thing. And in the article by Polanyi, Aristotle Discovers Economy, that I have uploaded to the website of this class, the distinction between oikos and chromatistics is adopted, if not drawn, by Aristotle, and Aristotle was aware of the two separate motives that could determine, to a large extent, the economic activities in general. One motive is what we call today the economic motives, the hope of gain. And Polanyi also adds the fear of hunger to this economic motive. So according to him, there are two basic economic motives: the hope of gain and the fear of starvation. If you do not have any income under a capitalist or market society, you will practically go hungry. It's that simple. So for this reason, we supply whatever we have, whatever we own, including our own labor power, to the market, and in return we get income which will be spent on goods and services so that we will get some utility, etc. Right? So the hope of gain in general, utility or profit, is the basic economic motive as we accept in economics today, right? Economics is the discipline about the allocation of scarce resources, remember. And this allocation is to be built upon preferences and the availability of resources in general. So basically, but in any case, since resources are scarce, we gotta make choices, and therefore economics is a choice theoretic discipline, which is based upon the idea of utilitarianism in general. You know, remember, utilitarianism is the philosophy that every human action is to be motivated by pleasure and pain in Bentham's version, of course. Today, we no longer use the terms pleasure and pain, but instead we use cost and benefit, right? Cost is usually understood as alternative costs or opportunity costs. So, but the idea is still the same. Human beings are concerned with their own self-interest and they behave in a rational way so as to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs. When costs are given, we try to achieve maximum benefit, or we try to achieve a certain amount of benefit with minimum cost, etc. This is the type of behavior that is necessary in a market, must be adopted by both households and the firms in general. This motivation is called by Aristotle exchange for its own sake, or exchange for the sake of achieving gain. It's called chromatistics. On the other hand, we have this oikos. Remember the name of our discipline, oikos nomos. So oikos is about the governing of the oikos. Oikonomia is about the governing of the oikos. So it's part of ethics. Basically, it deals with a good life, so to speak. So Aristotle argues that human beings are concerned with achieving a good life that is to be characterized by the realization of human potentials that are given to us as human beings, as members of the human species, right? We all are defined by these potentials, human potentials, and all of us, our own aim is to realize these potentialities and even develop them if possible. So this is the meaning of life, and this meaning, according to Aristotle, can be captured by the term eudaimonia, human flourishing, sometimes translated as happiness. So it's the definition of the good life, realization of human potential so that we can become a full-fledged human being, mature human being, whatever you call. So every one of us has this potential, but that doesn't necessarily mean that each one of us will achieve this final, ultimate aim. Some of us, unfortunately, will stop at the point at which they will be less than human being. Well, of course, this has nothing to do with a kind of racist argument. You know, racism is based upon the idea that some human beings are not exactly human beings, they are less than human beings. To be sure, of course, Aristotle also thought so when it comes to the problem of slavery. You know, Aristotle lived in an ancient Greek society, in Athens, in a slave society. So he argues also that some people are born to become slaves, but unfortunately, he can never defend it on some rational ground. Well, this is understandable because Aristotle is a man of his time also, just like we are, product of our own time, right? Today, we no longer think that some people deserve to be slaves, but still racism and xenophobia, unfortunately, is still part and parcel of today's modern society, especially these days. You know, you may have witnessed some Western guys arguing that Ukrainians are different from Syrians, Middle Easterns, Afghans, etc. they are more civilized and their physical structure, physical properties are different from those of the Middle Eastern guys, etc., etc. So they should be protected. This is pure racism, right? This is also Orientalism. Anyway, but still, unfortunately, there is still discrimination against different ethnic groups, even discrimination against gender and against sexual orientation, etc. It's against religious beliefs, etc., etc. Unfortunately, since the time of Aristotle, we haven't come a long way in this regard, at least, it seems. Anyway, so, but Aristotle talks about the general human beings or free human beings, and this achieving realization of potential, of the human potential, is also a state in which human beings are free in general. Freedom is to be defined with reference to this self-realization in general. This is also true for Marx, for example, and interestingly, this is also true for Karl Polanyi and many people in the intellectual history of human beings in general. Since at least the Enlightenment taught, Enlightenment emphasizes the importance of the solidarity among people, among human beings. Each one of us are members of the human species, so there's no difference among people in terms of their races, their identity, their nationality, their religious beliefs, etc., etc. Some people, even like, especially the postmodern guys these days, argue that Enlightenment is actually a Eurocentric position, which considers Europe and the Europeans at the center of the world, so the rest of the world are subject to discrimination, even colonization, expropriation of their lands, etc., etc. This is also called imperialism, and unfortunately, again, imperialism still exists, and from time to time, it brings about wars, right? The Russian case reveals that this is also a kind of imperialism. Anyway, and also there are different forms of imperialism or wishes to be imperialist among the different countries in the world, or different blocks, so to speak, the Western and the Eastern and so forth. Anyway, so according to Aristotle, at least for all human beings, we have this way. This is the way, right? To be a human being, we try to achieve our own self-realization, which can be characterized by Aristotle as the self-sufficiency or autarky. And Aristotle also adds that since by nature human beings are social beings, political animals, they are beings of the polis, they cannot exist without the polis, and a human being is therefore a social being which has to enter into constant interaction and exchanges with other individuals within the society. And here Aristotle argues that this self-sufficiency of the person cannot be independent of the self-sufficiency of the polis. So from an ethical point of view, a good individual can only be possible in a good society, so to speak, that is to be characterized as self-sufficiency of the polis. So any economic activity, must be aimed at realization of this self-sufficiency of the polis, because if a polis is not self-sufficient, an individual cannot be self-sufficient as well. So with respect to economic activities, we have a distinction between economic activities for the sake of the polis itself and economic activities for the sake of the individual herself to achieve greater wealth and economic power, etc. The latter is considered as wrong by Aristotle, and the former is considered as right from an ethical or moral perspective. So this is the beginning of economics, but this beginning has little to do with what we think today as what counts as economic activity. Economic activities are the same throughout the ages, to be sure, productive activities and also activities of consumption, distribution, and growth actually are considered as economic activities. This is the boundaries of our discipline. This was true for the Aristotle's time. This is true for the 18th century, and this is also true for us today. So this is in general what we do. The final ultimate aim is, of course, to survive, right? In order for human beings to survive, they must eat. It's a simple principle, but very important, because if you are hungry, etc., etc., you all know the story, right? But the way we view economics as a science could be different depending on our ethical considerations. If we think that Aristotle was right, and so was Marx, for example, our basic aim, or our aim of economics in general, to be useful as a tool that can be used to achieve happiness of humanity in general. By happiness, we mean, self-realization of all human beings, right? So that we all become full-fledged human beings, so that we can realize our own potentials, etc. So this is one way of looking at economic activities, and this is informed or even determined by ethics. But today in economics departments throughout the world, of course, we look at economic activities in terms of this cost-benefit logic, right? Cost-benefit reasoning. Everything is about human self-interest, individual self-interest. Even a human being is always considered as an individual. And she's considered as homo economicus or homo economicus. Homo economicus or homo economicus, same in Latin, I guess. So we have to consider human behavior on the basis of these two economic motives. It's a matter of choice, not necessarily a matter of choice, of course. Today, no one, almost in any economics department, talks about Aristotelian understanding of ethics and its relation to economics, etc., etc., unless she is an economic historian or a historian of economic thought in general, such as myself. So, but still, today, if you want to understand our own society, we should use the categories that are important in a market society. So there's a sharp distinction between a market society that is to be characterized by chrematistics, as Aristotle will call it, and the earlier forms of social and economic organizations. So some people, most economists actually, deny this sharp distinction between capitalism and pre-capitalism, so to speak, and they argue that human beings are all the same. At all times and all places, right? We are human beings. Our own nature actually is about the maximization or optimization of our benefits, right? That's the basic idea. So this was true for Aristotle. This was true even before the dawn of civilization, so to speak. So there has always been trade and economic exchanges and the merchants and economic activities, right? The name Cyprus, for example, in the ancient world, even before the Greeks, comes from copper, right? Because Cyprus is a very important source of copper, which was important in the Copper Age, right? You know, human history are categorized in different places. There's this Copper Age, then Bronze Age, and then Iron Age, and whatever. Some people say that today we live in the nuclear age or something, or computer age, actually, digital age, whatever, IT, information technologies, information age, whatever you call it. So merchants and greed is an integral part of being a human, right? We always consider ourselves as individuals, and individuals are driven by the motive of gain in general, or by the motive of fear of hunger, as Polanyi would say. I think that's better, yes. But we also said that last time, there's a sharp distinction in terms of the attitude towards economic activities within human history, and this sharp distinction emerges with the advance of capitalism or the market society. Capitalism and market society are synonyms, actually. Some people argue that they are not, actually, but in general, the word capitalism was popularized by Marxists. You know, Marx's famous book's name is Kapital, Das Kapital in German. So capitalism is about, capitalism refers to a society or economic organization that is determined by capital. What is capital? You know, in our classes, we teach that capital is produced production goods, right? In general, it's production goods. There's a difference between the classical or political economy's understanding of capital and our understanding of capital, but more or less, this is a fair characterization of capital. So capital is at the basis of the capitalist society, the market society. All exchanges are to be taking place within markets. A market is a setting in which there's demand and supply, therefore buyers and sellers, households and firms, etc., etc. So basically, this is how economic activities are organized within a market society, through markets, and it is based upon the institution of private property over the means of production, right? So if we do not own some means of production, then we cannot have any income because we have nothing to offer in the market, etc. So this is the idea, and markets organize the production decisions and also consumption decisions and also distribution and growth decisions within a country or within the globe as a whole, right? This is the basic idea. So capitalism is a relatively new phenomenon in human history. You know, it starts, well, there's a debate about this, but more or less since the 15th to 16th centuries, there is capitalism in different guises. At first, it starts with as a kind of merchant capitalism, mercantilism. And then the classical political economy arise, which is a result of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th centuries and the early 19th centuries, of course. And then since that time, we live under capitalism. Karl Polanyi himself, for example, argues that capitalism starts in 1830s and 40s with three important acts or laws. One is the Act of Banking Act, which establishes the institution of money and credit system, the gold standard. And the second is the amendment of the Poor Laws in 1848, I guess, which organizes the labor market. And the other law, which is the earliest one, I guess, in 1930s, the repeal of the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws actually, this repeal of the Corn Laws actually signifies the establishment for a market for land as a factor of production. So it's relatively new if we are to accept what Polanyi says. At least since the 19th century, since the beginning of 19th century, we have a full-fledged capitalism, because capitalism requires the markets, especially markets for factors of production, labor, land, and capital. So all exchanges must be taking place within markets. So all exchanges are market exchanges, and our decisions are to be determined, or at least conditioned, by this institutional setting. And in this institutional setting, according to Polanyi again, there are two different settings or different spheres within a market society. One is the economic sphere, economic institutional sphere, which is market itself, self-regulated market. And there should be no outside intervention on the part of the state, for example, into the working of any market. The markets must be left to their own devices. This is basically what we teach in the economics departments, right? Markets are assumed to work under perfect competitions, and anyone can freely enter into the market. There's, for this reason, of course, the market system is also called as free enterprise economy or free enterprise system. They are the same. So if the market, if a single market is left to its own devices, it will achieve equilibrium. And if all markets work under perfect competition, then there will be general equilibrium, and this general equilibrium will yield the highest welfare that is possible with the existing technology and the resources. And also this will bring about a stable social order in which everyone is happy. Happy means, they satisfy their needs in the best way compared to other forms of society, such as a pre-capitalist society or such as socialist society, for example, the Soviet Union. This is what we teach, right? This is the first institutional sphere, which is the market or self-regulating market, according to Polanyi. And the other is the rest of the society or the political sphere. Political means basically, Aristotelian notion, we would say, or which is prevalent in the ancient Greece. It's about polis, right? Today, for sure, of course. We no longer have polis or the states. Well, maybe Singapore is a kind of a city country, but not a city state. Anyway, so the polis is about the rest of the economic activities. The liberal distinction between state, political society and the civil society is a reflection of this institutional separation, actually. On the one hand, we have the market functions according to its own laws, self-regulating, demand and supply. On the other hand, we have political society, which actually signifies the state or the public sphere. Sometimes it is called, right? Republic means basically the public things, think, I'm sorry, res means in Latin, I guess, at least, think. Public is the public, democracy or republic is about the public thing, the rest of the society other than the market. So in a capitalist society, human beings assume two forms of existence, so to speak, according to Marx, for example, and also according to Polanyi. One, within the market, we act like homo economicus, concerned with our own self-interest, etc. On the other hand, within the political sphere, we act like political animals. We care about our own fellow individuals within the society, rest of the society, our own relatives, for example, our own family, etc., etc. So the motives are different in these two economic spheres, but neoclassicists, of course, reject such a distinction. They argue that human beings are always homo economicus, even in the political society. That's a long debate, actually. Maybe one day we can go into this. So anyway, in a market society, you have these two different institutional spheres, political sphere and the economic spheres, and there should be no interaction between these two spheres, in theory at least, but this is not possible because since human beings are political beings, according to Polanyi, there are certain interventions on the part of the political state, and these interventions will disrupt sooner or later the working of the market, and the result would be crisis and even the change of the political structure of the society, etc., etc. This is a similar understanding of the social change, sometimes with that of Marxists, actually, but there are some also important differences between Polanyi and Marx. Anyway, I have written a PhD dissertation about the relations between Polanyi and Marx. You can reach it through my website. If you are interested, you're welcome to read it, but anyway, you're not. You don't have to do this, of course. Anyway, so all of these discussions have to do with this distinction between two human nature conceptions. On the one hand, we have the Aristotelian most conception of human beings as political animals or social beings in general. And on the other hand, we have the neoclassical, so to speak, conception of human beings as homo economicus. So this is an important distinction. Why is this important? Because this distinction gives rise to two different conceptions of economics in general, or the science of the economy. Economics is about the science of the economy, but the very term economics itself was introduced in the late 19th century by Alfred Marshall. So before that, the name of our discipline was political economy. Well, even the term political economy was introduced in, I don't know, in the 16th century or something. No, not 16, maybe 17 and 18. And the political science that is called today and economics, political economy, are introduced during the emergence of advance of capitalism in the first place, of course, and emergence of the nation state, the late 17th century or the middle of the 17th century, because it's usually considered that the 1648 Westphalia peace can be taken as the starting point, symbolically, of course, of the beginning of the world divided by nation states. So the emergence of nation states first as kingdoms, monarchies, and then later, democracies after especially the British Revolution of the late 17th century and the French Revolution, especially in 1789. So since that time, the parliamentary democracy is considered as a standard for the market societies in general, although there are important differences among different countries in respect of the definition and applications of parliamentary democracy, as we all know, right? This is the idea. So basically, we have two conceptions of economic activities. One is the oikos type, the other is the chromatistics type. And some people, like Polanyi and Marx, argues that this distinction between the two is a sharp distinction which cannot be reduced to each other. To be sure, of course, market exchanges existed in earlier times, and still within a market society, these oikos type economic exchanges or activities still exist in some extent, but they are not the organizing principle of the economic organization or social and economic organization of the society in general. A market society is a society in which market is the dominant organizing principle, whereas in a per-capitalist society, politics or political sphere that includes society and also religious aspects of society, etc., is the prime power and mover of the economic activities in general. So Polanyi argues that, for example, to think that, for example, the categories of capitalism or market society can be expanded or extended to other types of society or economic organizations within history is a kind of economistic fallacy. You know, capitalism, market society is an economic society in all its meanings. It's an economic society because every decisions are based upon these two economic motives: the hope of gain and the fear of hunger. Therefore, in the earlier times, before capitalism emerges, there was no such necessity, and economic activities themselves were conditioned, determined, or regulated by political authorities, depending on the specific type of the society, right? In tribal societies, for example, this political authority is the chief. In an empire such as the Rome or even Ottoman Empire, for example, the center is the emperor, right, itself, or the sultan. And in other types of societies, in a monarchy, for example, the king is the supreme power, etc., etc. Okay, so returning to Polanyi, maybe it's good to show this, what Polanyi says in that. Well, Polanyi argues that, if I can find it, of course, where are you? Yes, here, got it. Okay, Polanyi argues that market society is different from other types of societies in human history. And market society started in 19th century with these three acts, establishing the markets for labor, land, and money, or capital in general, according to him. For Polanyi, these are not commodities in the empirical sense of the word. A commodity is something that is produced in the first place to sell in the market. So you can produce some good items, but you may not sell them, in which case this is not a commodity. A commodity is produced for sale in the first place. This is the definition of commodity. In economics, we don't use in general the term commodity. We usually use goods. You know, a goods is something good because it confers us some utility. right? That's why it's good. We are concerned with utilities, etc. So for this reason, it is good, right? Naturally. But commodity is the general term. Anything that is produced for sale is a commodity. That's the thing. Some of the non-commodities can be also sold in the market, such as some rare paintings, for example, the sunflower paintings by Van Gogh, right? It wasn't meant to be a commodity. Maybe it was, you know, he wanted to sell this into the market so that he would not go hungry, at least. But these days, it becomes an investment item almost, right? More than $1 million, some 29, I guess, and some, the final selling price of one of these sunflower paintings by Van Gogh. Van Gogh's price. That's huge. Well, anyway, but most commodities are reproducible commodities through human labor, as Ricardo emphasizes. So market society is based upon commodity production. Of course, again, commodity production existed in earlier forms of society, but again, in terms of the principle of the organization of economic activities, commodities, and market relations are of utmost importance in our society. So basically, on the basis of this, the desire of gain and the fear of hunger becomes universal motive, so to speak. It applies to every human being in capitalism. So the result of this, as a reflection in our minds, was the economistic fallacy, what Polanyi calls. It is the identification of economic phenomena with market phenomena, or the extrapolation of the categories that are prevalent in capitalism to other societies and other times. So this gives rise to two ways of doing economics, so to speak. One is the formal meaning of economic, of the term economic, and the other is substantive meaning. Formal meaning is usually neoclassical meaning. You know, it's about the means and relationship. Human beings behave rationally in an optimizing way, allocation of scarce resources, this and that, etc. We all know what it is. And economic here denotes nothing else, according to Polanyi, than bearing reference to the process of satisfying material wants. Satisfaction, you all know Rolling Stones' famous song, right? I can't get no satisfaction. This is the tragedy of the Homo economicus, right? We always look for new forms of satisfaction, right? Some of us want to buy a Ferrari. Unfortunately, it's an impossibility for me now. And some of the others are concerned with anything, whatever. So basically, economic, in this formal definition, denotes nothing else than bearing reference to the process of satisfying material wants. Material refers to humans' dependence for her livelihood upon nature in the context of social relations. This is production. Incidentally, Marx calls this praxis human free and conscious activity to produce and reproduce herself in the first place through entering into constant interaction with nature. We transform nature, and within this process, we also transform ourselves. Yeah, this is a philosophical part of the idea, but the idea is always the same. We act upon nature, we change, we transform the nature to our satisfaction, of course, and even we see everything within the nature or even within the society as the tools that we can use to satisfy our own interests. This is how we see the world, right? Remember our discussion about the logos and the cosmos. The cosmos has been shattered in modern times with the advance of capitalism. Now we consider ourselves as atoms who are concerned with our own self-interest. So basically, this is the formal definition, right? It refers to the working of the market economy, and in the sense, formal economics is a self-reflection, so to speak, of capitalism, we can say. So the conceptual framework based on the notions of rationality and atomism is actually a distortion of human beings, if, of course, you consider human beings as social beings or political beings in the first place, as Polanyi calls. So basically, this is the way in which we see everything in this society. It's called an economistic culture. Schumpeter also says that capitalism is an economistic society. Everything in capitalism is economic. Everything, whatever you may think of, in terms of our own motives and human behavior, economic behavior. So the modus operandi, so to speak, is optimization in all spheres of life. And so all livelihood is how life is lived. On the other hand, as opposed to the formal, the substantive meaning stems in brief, this is what Polanyi says, from humans' patent dependence for her livelihood upon nature and her fellows. You know, in old times, people used to use terms man and his and so forth. Of course, these are old times. We are talking about about 1940s, basically. Marx also has this language, or any. There's, you know, in English, we have this distinction between he, she, etc. So in terms of human beings, they are accustomed to use the term man and him and his and whatever, but these days, everything changed, luckily, fortunately, right? Even we today are talking about non-binary individuals and so forth, but I don't know how to express this future when we talk about these relations. Anyway, human, that's better. Every one of us is a human being, right? In terms of our membership to the human species, our own potentials, etc., etc. So human survives by virtue of an institutionalized interaction between herself and her natural surroundings. That process is the economy. That's an interesting definition of the economy, very simple and very basic one, actually. Economy is the setting in which economic exchanges, economic activities, take place. This is an institutionalized setting. Institutions refer some social practices and social relations that are achieving some endurance within space and time. What I mean by this, family, for example, is a social institution, and family is formed by, nuclear family, at least, not the extended family, is formed by men and women and children. Of course, again, these days, we have single parent families and even gay couples and lesbian couples, etc., etc. But still, family is a continuous families continuously reproduced through marriages, formal or informal, doesn't matter. So basically, for example, of course, we do not get married in order to form the family as an institution, but the unintended result of our marrying is the production and reproduction of the family. right? Since many people do that, family emerges and reproduces itself as a social institution. So in that sense, institutions do have some endurance within time and space also, right? So economy is the institutionalized relations among individuals in terms of their creation of their own livelihoods or lives, effort to survive, acting upon nature. So the main thrust of the substantive approach is Polanyi's proposition is that man's economy as a rule is submerged in his social relations. This is a very important principle. Last time I mentioned the term embedded and disembedded, the distinction between embedded and disembedded, of course. And this is the same, submerged human relations, human economic activities are submerged or embedded within the social fabric, so to speak, in the sense that economic activities are organized or at least controlled by the political authority, whatever it is. It could be a religious authority, it could be the authority of the chief, authority of the state, authority of the emperor or the governor, whatever, doesn't matter. So economic activities are engaged for the sake of the survival of the community or society in general, oikos. So this is the meaning of embeddedness. This is true for all pre-capitalist economies, but capitalism is novel in this respect, in the sense that economic activities are no longer submerged or embedded within the social fabric, social relations, or social institutions. They are no longer controlled by the political authority, by the state. Even in a parliamentary democracy, the market has its own independence and freedom, so to speak, and it's self-regulating on the basis of the interaction between demand and supply and so forth. So this is how capitalist economy functions, or how it should functions, because in reality, we know that there are constant interactions on the part of the political authorities, political parties, the government, the state, and even some local political organizations, trade unions, etc., etc. So in theory, we maintain that as economists, of course, there should be no outside intervention into the working of the market itself. So this is how it should be if you want to achieve an efficient allocation of resources and social welfare and stable social order. So Polanyi argues that in terms of the substantive economics, we should see the human history in a different way than the neoclassical economics. You know, in neoclassical economics, in principle, there's no difference between capitalism and non-capitalist societies. So each are governed by the fear of, by the hope of gain, economic motives, and so forth. But Polanyi argues that capitalism or the market society is different from the rest of the society, is independent, from the rest of the society. So basically, the conceptual framework that we can use to understand pre-capitalist societies. By the way, this term pre-capitalist is not a very good term because it's too generalized term actually to include different variations of different societies in human history. There's a bundle of social and economic organizations that we encounter within human history and even today. So the term pre-capitalist is somewhat reductionist, but our aim is to draw a distinction between capitalism and non-capitalism, so to speak. So, historically speaking, of course, these correspond to any kind of pre-capitalist societies. But even today, for example, within Amazon, for example, there are some quote-unquote pre-capitalist societies, not necessarily capitalism, but unfortunately, they cannot escape from the reach of capitalism. Right? They smoke, for example, by using their lighters, etc., etc., whatever. Anyway, so this is an important, maybe let's stop here. And according to Polanyi, the conceptual framework, as I said, must be different to understand these pre-capitalist societies from the one that could be relevant for the market society of capitalism. And for this, he develops this, yes, here. Oops. Maybe I can change this. Forms of integration. Yes. He calls this forms of integration, and a form of integration is the way in which economic activities are integrated to each other. Okay, let me see. And here, for example, form of integrations. A form of integration is the way in which economic activities are organized, and this is a structured and institutionalized process. So institutions refers in the sense to the collective actions of individuals or persons in structured situations. So there are four, let's see, I'm sorry here, yep. Stop share, let's do it once again. Yes, this one. Forms of integration, the ways in which economic activities are organized within the society itself. According to Polanyi, there are four of them. Every human society can be understood by using one or the other of these forms of integration. For example, in a capitalist society, the basic form of integration is exchange, market exchange, and the basic institutional pattern is the market. Let me add here, institutional, yes. Exchange is based upon the motive of gain, utility, self-interest, right? It's a rational process. You know, people do enter into exchange relations with the hope of achieving greater utility or gain, right, in general. So exchange increases the gain, mutual gains of the both parties, right? Or there may be more than two parties, actually. It's possible. But in general, exchange is a process that increases the utilities or gains of respective parties entering into this relationship, and it is organized in the market. And this, again, form of organization of the social society or economic activities in general is specifically relevant to capitalism. Before capitalism, of course, there were markets, of course, there were market exchanges, but these had never been the principal, the primary, organization principle of economic activities. Economic activities are usually taken place within or under strict control of the political authority in general. But before capitalism, we had these three forms of integration. One is the Aristotelian or ancient Greece type form of integration, that is householding. Householding is about the oikos, right? This is what Aristotle calls oikos. Householding is about the achieving self-sufficiency for the household and therefore for the polis, and the basic principle is autarky, institutional pattern. And other than Greek society, we have a more general principle of reciprocity. Reciprocity is about mutual understanding and mutual action of individuals in a form of partnership, so to speak, to conduct a specific economic activity or specific non-economic activity or any type of activity. The basic motive here is not to achieve gain or achieving greater wealth or greater utility, etc., but it is an acceptable social behavior. This need not to be a direct relationship as in the market. You know, in a market exchange, there should be two sides, two parties at least, and the value to be exchanged that is subject to the exchange must be of equal value, right? You know, I have to pay the price that you have if I want to get that particular item, etc., etc. But in reciprocity, it's not a kind of equal exchange, it's a form of unequal exchange, and it need not be a direct relationship or face-to-face relationship between individuals. For example, one of the examples that Polanyi gives was the behavior in a Pacific island, Trobriand Island, if I'm not mistaken. For example, if someone does a favor to me, I need to do a favor, favor, not to this person, but a relative of this person from her mother's side. This could be a very complicated thing at the same time, right? You know, this may be seen as absurd for us. If you have some advantage, you gotta pay its price. Of course, here there is also a similar relationship. You know, it's like if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But here you can scratch the backs of some other guy. Of course, here the organizing principle of this exchange is not economic motives or gain, but social relations. You know, relatives. I have to do a favor. And also it's a kind of unequal exchange. If I'm rich, for example, I may present something more valuable. And in return, you are expected to give me some other thing, but not necessarily of the same value, right? You may be a poor person, so what you gave must be proportional with your wealth or social status, right? If I'm the king or the lord or the for example, I have to behave accordingly. If the subject of the king or the serf or the marava, whatever, is in this relationship, he or she is expected to return the favor, but not of the same value. The Lord is responsible for protecting the serf, and in return, the serf must work at least some days in the week for the Lord himself. This is the idea of reciprocity, and here we have this principle, institutional principle of symmetry. Symmetry in the sense that, you know, reciprocal, the relations are reciprocal, must be reciprocal, but not guided by economic motives, basically. It's based upon, mostly in early forms of society, on kinship, for example, relatives, etc. And also these interactions must occur according to the social status of the two parties that are entering into this relationship, etc. Polanyi later, in the 1950s, 1958, 57 to be exact, says that householding is actually a specific form of reciprocity because the principles are always the same. So we can reduce these forms of integration into three: reciprocity, redistribution, and exchange. So reciprocity is usually encountered in tribal societies, for example, or little communities, city-states, whatever. And redistribution principle requires a center, political center, or even a religious center. As in the Sumerian society, for example, here the Sumerian society, they say, the ziggurat, the temple is the center, and it collects taxes in the form of grain, of course, and these grain are collected, are stored in the temple when it is necessary. It is redistributed to the society when there's a famine, for example, etc. So a powerful center is necessary, as in the empire, for example, as the Roman Empire or the Hellenistic Empire of Alexander the Great, and even the Ottoman Empire, and the Russia at Tsar's times. The word Tsar actually comes from Caesar. It is the Russian version of Caesar. Caesar refers to Roman Empire, right? After Caesar, of course, Julius Caesar. Anyway, so there's a center, and this center collects the taxes from the subjects. They are not yet citizens, but they are considered as subjects of the king or the lord, whatever. And then, when necessary, they are redistributed to these subjects, or some public expenditures are made from this money, from these taxes, and raising an army, entering into war, protecting the country, etc., etc. These are the functions of the state, or the lord, or the king, whatever. And so it's a form of integration that is based upon the institutional pattern that's called centricity. A powerful, economically and politically, a powerful center is necessary, and this center organizes the economic activities in general. And Polanyi argues that if you look at human history, you will see one of these forms of integration in the organization of economic activities. So when we are talking about economics, we must have a substantivist understanding of the economy as the organization of economic activities that is guided, governed, or controlled by political authorities or by social relations in general. And only in market societies does the economy is organized along the lines of the markets, so which is thought to be independent of the rest of the society. So this is an interesting methodological argument. Human history is different in terms of the economic behavior throughout times. Unlike neoclassical economists, Polanyi does not believe that human beings are always the same, had always been the same throughout the ages. Well, to be sure, what we call human nature is the same, and it is the Aristotelian conception of human nature. Human beings are social beings, but other than that, the specific type of the economic organization maybe and usually are different from the market societies, although there are again limited forms of integration according to society. On the basis of this, we can argue that as a general principle or conclusion. In the human history, economic activities, the way in which economic activities are organized, depends on the particular type of society. You know, in a capitalist or market society, this organization is to be carried out by or through markets. Whereas in other forms, non-capitalist or pre-capitalist societies in the human history, these economic activities are organized on the basis of social relations, or the political spheres actually control the working of the economic sphere, so to speak. In other words, there's no sharp distinction between, institutional speaking, between the political sphere and the economic sphere, because economic sphere itself is embedded or submerged or buried, if you will, within the social structure, social institutional structure of the society. This also includes production techniques and even technology, etc., etc. So this is an interesting account, and this account is similar, actually, to that of Marx, who argues that, as I explained briefly in the starting of this class today, and it is, let me see if I can find it here. Yes, for Marx, for example, the methodological principles are different from those of Polanyi's, actually, but they are quite similar. And Marx also argues that, you know, every mode of production, as he calls it, the organization of economic and social activities, is historically transient and different. There's a constant change throughout human history. But if you want to understand a specific type of a society at a given time, what you have to do is to look at the relationship between what he calls the economic base and the superstructure. And he has three important claims in this book. A contribution to the critique of political economy. Actually, the preface of that book, because the book itself is about working of the capitalist economy and value process and the determination of prices, etc., etc. But the preface is very interesting. It's a short one, like 5 to 6 pages, and in the 3 pages of this preface, Marx develops, is argued to develop, this historical materialism. Well, curiously, Marx never uses the term historical materialism or the materialist interpretation of history. These two terms belong to Engels, Marx's companion, close friends, supporter, whatever. But still, you know, it's a general term that could apply to Marxian understanding of history. And some people argue that Marx's most important contribution to historical studies and also economic studies is this historical materialism. And 3 theses. 1, economic base, which is nothing but the relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of the material forces of production. Material forces of production, the resources that we use in the production process, factors of production, we call them, and also technology, the way in which production, the methods, techniques that are used in the production process in general. So for Marx, there's a correspondence between relations of production and forces of production. What relations of production is actually relations of property over the means of production, over the forces of production. And each society is characterized by some technological form, that is appropriate to this specific type of mode of production. For example, feudal society in the Middle Ages is to be characterized by windmill, the mill that is powered by water in general. Before, of course, in the ancient slavery, the source of power is human power, the power of slaves and animals and so forth. But in the Middle Ages, there are some interesting innovations were introduced. One of them was this windmill, and the other is plow, heavy iron plow that is instrumental in production of agricultural goods. It increases the productivity of agriculture in general. So, and capitalism in its beginning, of course, is associated with steam mill. Marx even says that steam mill gives us the capitalist and so forth in his poverty of philosophy. Actually, I have a paper, a long one, about the discussion of historical materialism. I can upload it to your website, to my website, to the website of the class. But it's a bit difficult to understand. It could be difficult to understand for you, and it's a bit long, but let me think about it. Anyway, so basically, at the very bottom, so to speak, there's a visual representation of this, and reduction is done, of course. At the bottom, we have these forces of production and labor, capital, and technology, and relations of production is built upon the forces of production, and these two, relations of production and forces of production, together form the economic base. This is a kind of, architectonic analogy, so to speak. Any house must be built upon some base, right? So in that sense, any society must be built upon this base. And this economic base is formed by two related categories or layers, strata. One is the forces of production, the other is relations of production, and upon the economic base is this superstructure. Superstructure is related to thinking in general. It's about religion, law, science, government, political structure of society, etc. Yeah. In other words, if you want to understand any society, you should look at the economic base rather than the political superstructure. In today's world, for example, almost all, with the exception of Cuba and other minor states, Korea, North Korea, and so forth, all states are capitalist states, right? Their political structures are different, their political organization are different, their implementation of parliamentary democracy are different, some of them are governed by autocrats and so forth, but by itself, this political structure cannot help you to understand in a deeper way the working of this society. All you have to do is to look at the base, economic base, and the organization of production process, in other words. And it is based upon property relations, and of course, they are developed upon forces of production. So if you look at the economic base closely, what we will see that in all societies, all countries, today's world, we have this capitalist way of organization of society, or capitalism, or the market system in general, right? So what we see is the political differences, maybe, but what is actually important is the economic base, which lies underneath of the political structure, yet this deep structure, economic base, regulates and governs and even controls the political structure as well. So as economists, especially as political economists, actually, one should look at the economic base according to Marx. Also, this particular methodological framework is also helpful to understand social change. According to Marx, there's always a contradiction within the economic base between the relations of production and forces of production. For example, we said that in a feudal society and in the Middle Ages, windmill was an important technology with heavy iron plugs, etc. But towards the end of the 18th centuries, steam power was invented. Well, steam power was known actually within human history, but it cannot be used effectively within the production process. There's a Greek guy, for example, or Roman, I guess, an inventor who built a toy that is working by using steam power. It is like the tribune, a kind of steam tribune in a smaller scale, of course. But this idea of steam tribune were used in the history of capitalism. Even the jet engines today are based upon are developed on the basis of this idea of the tribune. Instead of steam, we use electricity or still water sometimes, right? Hydroelectric plants, and also through some petroleum derivatives, whatever, oil, etc. So, but in the late 18th century, steam engine was introduced, and it was first used in agriculture, well, actually in the coal mines, then agriculture, then in the industry, in the textile industry, and so forth. So it started a revolution, which is called industrial revolution, which made England, or Britain in general, as the most advanced society in the 19th century and the most developed capitalist economy. So, but when this steam engine was developed, this steam engine was perfected by James Watt, who still used watt as the unit of what, energy? Yes, I guess. So within the late 18th century, steam engine also gives rise the factory system, which is at the basis of capitalist organization of the production process in general and so forth. But when this steam engine was introduced, the social organization or relations of production of the economy or the society in general was still along the feudal lines. There are aristocrats who control the surplus produced in the economy. The surplus is created by the capitalists and workers, of course, but they are expropriated, so to speak, most of it in forms of land rent. Was the landlords or aristocracy, though, so they had to be overthrown, first in England, starting from the middle of the 17th century, 1648. And with the French Revolution, the aristocracy had become an insignificant social class, both economically and politically, and capitalists or the bourgeoisie had gained prominence within the society and so forth. So this contradiction, production is organized along capitalist lines in terms of steam engine and factory system and so forth, but social structure and political structure is still controlled and regulated by the aristocracy, as that has nothing to do with the production process. but still benefits from these products of the production process in general. So this contradiction between the relations of production and forces of production will bring about a social revolution, a social change. If you look at human history, at least in the Western Europe, what we see is this dynamic or this dialectic at a certain stage of development, as Marx says. The material productive forces of society came into conflict with the existing relations of production or with the profit relations. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters, then begins an era of social revolution. This is how capitalism emerges. Capitalism becomes victorious both economically or first economically and then politically, with French Revolution and the following revolutions of 1830s and 1848, etc., etc. So this is what Marx says. So you can see that this idea is similar to that of Polanyi, because both things like capitalism is different and market exchanges are the primary mode of capitalist economy. It's a market system and so forth. It is regulated or dominated by capital, and it's a capitalist society for this reason. And pro-capitalist societies are to be done by different principles. But there's also a difference between Polanyi and Marx, of course, which that in Marx still this economic determinist approach, everything is about economic relations and production, causes of production, etc., etc., even before capitalism. According to Marx, it's important. And so this is a form of economic determinism, which have some other problems, associated problems, such as the omission of individual free activity or free will in general, but still it's an economically and even technologically deterministic position, which Polanyi does not like very much. And he argues that only capitalist economy, capitalist society is governed by economic principles. To think contrary is a form of economistic fallacy, and therefore Marx himself was committed to economistic fallacy in this regard. But still, they unite with each other in that they both accept the importance of economic factors, at least in the working of capitalism, and human history is different from capitalism in terms of the motives and organizing principles of the production process. I think we should start here because it's getting late.